Imagine this. It's Thanksgiving Day. Your family gathered around the table, the scent of turkey in the air. But something's wrong. The door creaks open, no one's there. A shadow lingers outside. What happens next will make you rethink every holiday gathering you've ever had. In today's video, we dive deep into a true Thanksgiving horror story. From eerie encounters in the woods to terrifying dinner table surprises, these tales will leave you questioning what really lurks in the shadows during the season of gratitude. But before I continue, if you do enjoy these chilling stories, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss out on more terrifying tales. Join the looming nightmare community where the fear never ends. It started as a typical Thanksgiving for the Williams family. The house was warm, filled with the sounds of laughter, clinking silverware, and the aroma of a perfectly roasted turkey. Julia, the youngest of the siblings, was home for the holiday after a long year in college. Her brothers, Greg and Mark, and her parents, Bob and Linda, were all seated around the table. The fire crackled in the hearth, the centerpiece of the cozy living room, and everything seemed perfect. A scene that could have been lifted straight from a Norman Rockwell painting. But that warmth? It was fleeting. Julia couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, something she couldn't explain. Maybe it was the way the house felt colder than usual, or perhaps the unease that settled over her when she stepped outside earlier that day to retrieve something from the car. The trees in the yard had seemed to sway just a little too much, as though they were whispering secrets to one another. The family had finished dinner, and now they were lounging around, chatting about their lives. Julia was sharing stories from her first year away at school. Mark was cracking jokes, and Greg was silently poking at his phone, absorbed in some game. Linda and Bob smiled at the conversation, occasionally nodding. But then, the door to the living room creaked open. No one had gotten up to answer it. "Did you hear that?" Julia asked, looking around the room, trying to pinpoint the source of the strange noise. Everyone looked at her, confused. "Hear what?" Bob asked. "I swear I heard the door open," she said, her voice uneasy. The family fell silent for a moment, and the sound of the fire crackling was the only thing that filled the room. "Maybe it's the wind," Greg said dismissively, his eyes still glued to his phone. But Julia couldn't shake the feeling. Something wasn't right. She stood up and walked toward the door, slowly. Her heart raced as she reached for the handle. The chill in the air seemed to grow more intense with each step. As she touched the door, a sudden gust of wind blew through the crack, making the door creak again. She hesitated for a moment, then pulled it open. Nothing. No one. Just the cold, dark night outside. The porch light flickered, but that wasn't what unsettled her the most. It was the shadow. A large, dark figure standing at the edge of the yard, just beyond the reach of the porch light. It was hard to make out any details in the dark, but Julia could tell it wasn't any of her family members. She backed away from the door, her breath catching in her throat. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, staring at the house. "Hey, is everything okay?" Mark called from the other room, noticing her reaction. I don't know. I think someone's out there," Julia said, her voice trembling. Bob stood up, a little annoyed. "We're in the middle of dinner, Julia. It's probably just a neighbor or someone walking by." But Julia couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was out there wasn't just a passerby. She slowly closed the door and locked it, her eyes still fixed on the shadow through the window. It hadn't moved, but she felt like it was watching her. "Let's just finish dinner, okay?" Bob said, trying to keep the mood light. "You're probably just tired. You've been traveling all day." Julia nodded, but her mind kept racing. Who was out there? What did they want? And why were they standing in the dark, not moving, not responding? The family went back to their conversation, but Julia couldn't focus. Her eyes kept darting toward the window, hoping to see any sign of movement, but there was nothing. Just the stillness of the night. Then, a loud knock at the door. It was sharp, insistent. Everyone froze. "Who's that?" Linda whispered, her voice full of concern. Julia was already on her feet again. Her heart was pounding in her chest as she made her way toward the door. "I don't know, but I'm not opening it." She looked through the peephole but saw nothing. No shadow, no figure. Just the dark expanse of the front porch. What's going on? Greg asked, getting up from his chair. He walked over to the door and knocked on it himself, testing if it was locked properly. It was. The knock came again, louder this time. Okay, this is ridiculous, Bob said, standing up. I'm calling the police. It's probably just some kids messing around. He pulled out his phone and dialed, but as soon as he hit the call button, the lights flickered. Then they went out completely. A moment of silence. Then a sound, a scraping noise, like nails against the glass. Everyone looked at one another, fear slowly creeping into their eyes. What the hell's going on? Mark muttered. Stay here, Bob said, his voice tense. He grabbed a flashlight from the drawer and cautiously made his way to the back door. But before he could reach it, the phone rang. It was an unknown number. Hello, Bob answered. The voice on the other end was faint, barely audible. Get out of the house. Bob's heart skipped a beat. Who is this? The voice didn't answer. Instead, the phone line went dead. He turned to his family. We need to leave. Now. But as he turned, the scraping noise at the window grew louder. Everyone turned toward the glass. The figure was back, standing right there, its face obscured by the darkness. But now they could see its hands, twisted and claw-like, dragging across the window pane. Suddenly, the door flew open. No one had touched it. A chill swept through the room, and the temperature dropped, making the air feel thick and suffocating. Run! Bob shouted. The family scrambled to their feet, rushing for the door. But as they reached the threshold, they stopped in their tracks. The shadow was no longer just on the outside. It was standing right in front of them, its dark, hollow eyes locked onto theirs. Julia screamed, but the figure didn't move. It simply stared. Why are you here? Mark demanded, but the figure said nothing. Then, with a sudden burst of motion, the figure lunged forward. The room erupted in chaos, as everyone pushed past one another, trying to get out. But as Julia stepped outside, the shadow seemed to follow her. It was no longer just an apparition. It was a presence, a force that wouldn't let her go. With a final, terrified glance over her shoulder, she saw it. The figure was standing just behind her, grinning. A grin so wide it seemed unnatural. And in its hands, the same carving knife that had been used to slice the turkey earlier. As Julia's breath hitched in her chest, she stumbled backward, feeling her legs give way beneath her. The shadow, the thing that had been haunting her family all evening, was closer than ever, its presence overwhelming and suffocating. The air had turned cold, and the sound of the wind howling outside now felt like a distant memory, drowned out by the low, guttural growls coming from the figure's throat. It wasn't human. Not anymore. Julia's pulse hammered in her ears as she reached out toward the door, her fingers brushing the cold brass handle. But it was too late. Her hand shook uncontrollably, a sudden rush of panic flooding her body. The figure's eyes bore into hers, deep, empty, as if it were looking straight through her, seeing her every fear, every regret. Get away from me, she screamed, her voice cracking. But the figure didn't flinch. It was like it had all the time in the world, and it was in no hurry to end her suffering. Behind her, the sound of footsteps pounding across the wooden floor echoed through the house. Her family had made it outside, but Julia couldn't tear her eyes away from the horror in front of her. It was as though her body had frozen in place, unwilling to act. She wanted to run, wanted to escape, but all she could do was stare in terror. Then, she heard her father's voice, weak and desperate. Julia! He was still out there, somewhere in the darkness, trying to reach her. But every step they took, it seemed like the shadow was growing more powerful. It was as if the very house itself was consumed by the thing, its walls closing in. Julia could hear her family calling her name, but their voices felt distant, muffled, as though they were being sucked into an abyss. She looked over her shoulder, her eyes darting frantically, trying to find them, to make sense of what was happening. But when she turned back, the shadow was standing even closer, its face twisting into something grotesque. A voice, low, cold, and distorted, whispered in her ear, "You can't escape!" Suddenly, everything went dark. Julia's vision blurred, and the ground beneath her feet felt like it was shifting. A sense of vertigo swept over her, as though the very space around her was collapsing in on itself. Then, She was falling. Her body slammed against the hard ground, the coldness of it seeping into her bones. Her head throbbed and the taste of iron filled her mouth. She tried to move, but something was holding her down. It wasn't a physical restraint. No, this was something far worse. It was the feeling of being trapped in a nightmare, her mind unable to break free. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't scream. There was nothing but silence, broken only by the faint rustle of leaves somewhere in the distance. The shadow, the figure, was gone, but its presence still lingered, suffocating her, filling her with dread. It wasn't over. Not yet. As she lay there, frozen in terror, Julia felt something shift behind her. A slow, deliberate movement. Her heartbeat quickened and she tried to move again, but her limbs were heavy, numb, as though they didn't belong to her. Panic surged through her chest, and in a final act of desperation, she screamed, hoping, praying someone would hear her. But the only answer she received was the sound of footsteps, heavy and purposeful, approaching from the darkness. The figure wasn't done with her. To this day, no one knows what happened to the Williams family. Julia's parents were found days later, their bodies lifeless and cold, sprawled in front of the house as though they had been dragged out. The police could never find any trace of her brothers or the figure that had tormented them. The house itself? It was abandoned, left to rot, as if something had taken hold of it. There were rumors that the shadow still lingered in the woods behind the house, waiting for the next unsuspecting family to enter its grasp. And every Thanksgiving, when the wind howls through the trees and the night grows cold, some say you can still hear the whispers of those lost. The figure's still out there, watching, waiting. If you want more horror stories like this, subscribe to my YouTube channel.